Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. My guest today is Amy-Jill Levine. She is Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace in the United States. She has held office in the Society of Biblical Literature, the Catholic Biblical Association, and the Association for Jewish Studies. Amy-Jill, you are Jewish, but you have published books on the New Testament and on Jesus. How come?
It does seem a little counterintuitive, but if we think about history, Jesus is a Jew. All of his initial followers are Jews. Paul is a Jew. All the Marys are Jews. So in studying the New Testament, and specifically in studying Jesus in his historical context, what I'm actually doing is Jewish history. And it's Jewish history I didn't learn in the synagogue. I didn't learn it in my own tradition because the New Testament is not read by Jews liturgically. So if I want to fill in the gaps in Jewish history, the New Testament is one of my best sources.
You've been doing this for many years, and you have a
Many years.
Many years. And one of your books is called Jesus for Everyone. And it starts with a sentence, Jesus is fascinating. I like the word fascinating, as it reminds me of different facets. Jesus is described in so many different situations, and he always has a story to tell. Which ones of Jesus' actions do you consider to be typical for a Jew in his time?
Much of Jesus is typical for other Jews at the time. So just telling parables. Parables are a known genre that we find in what Christians would call the Old Testament, what Jews would call the Tanakh. We find parables in rabbinic literature. So teaching by parables. Looking at the scriptures of Israel, like the Torah, the first 5 books, right? And then saying, well, how do we interpret that? Because all law needs to be reinterpreted. What does this mean for us today? How do we understand the characters who show up, whether it's Abraham or Jacob or David or Moses? How do we understand them? So by reinterpreting Torah, by giving us his understanding of Moses or his understanding of Abraham, Jesus is participating in first century Jewish life. By arguing with other Jews, he's being a good Jew. Because what could be more important than arguing about what you think God wants you to do? And when we get to rabbinic literature, so post-biblical Jewish literature written after the time of Jesus, we find that the rabbis use an expression, arguments for the sake of heaven. And they talk about different rabbinic schools having different ways of understanding Torah, different ways of understanding when you say prayers, how you say prayers, with whom you say prayers, what prayers you say. These are arguments for the sake of heaven, because they're arguments that are trying to determine what is the best thing that God wants from us. So by arguing with fellow Jews about what you do in the synagogue on the Sabbath, for example, Jesus is just being a good Jew. By dying on a Roman cross, he dies like thousands of others on a Roman cross. And even proclamations of resurrection are common in first century Judaism. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. In fact, the New Testament talks about a group called the Sadducees. And when it mentions them, it usually says the Sadducees, those who don't believe in resurrection of the dead, which means that pretty much all the other Jews were. So Jesus fits perfectly in a first century Jewish environment. His followers' claims about him as the Messiah or even raised from the dead fit within a first century Jewish environment. And the only way we know that is if we actually go back and we do the history.
And I like when you say the Jewish tradition is very much about stories, because when you look at the Haggadah, or you learn a lot through stories, and you repeat the stories again and again, and you ask questions during the Seder meal. And I think that's another way to learn. One of my Jewish friends said, if you want to teach somebody, you have to tell stories.
Exactly. And then what you do, and thank you for bringing up the idea of asking questions. That's very much part of the Jewish tradition. So why do we do this? Why is this night different from all other nights? Why do we keep the Sabbath? Why do we honor it and keep it holy? And it's sometimes different answers will come up because different people will have different responses. Why do we honor the Sabbath? Because God ceased from work on the seventh day and hallowed the Sabbath. That's the beginning of Genesis 2. Why do we honor the Sabbath? Because Deuteronomy says you were slaves in Egypt and God brought you out from there with an outstretched arm. So therefore, because you know what it's like to be enslaved, the Sabbath guarantees you will never be fully enslaved again. So why do we do what we do? As we go through history, we come up with different reasons for why we do what we do. And then what we do as Jews is we add our voice to that tradition, to what Torah says, to what Second Temple Jews were saying, to what Pharisees were saying, to what the rabbis said, to what we say today in 2024. So it's very participatory.
Yes, I think that this is really important, and I like very much this tradition because it's just like you try to teach. Even when you think of children, you teach them how to behave in society, and you tell them fairy tales because you want them to get the essence, and that's why Titipounamu Study and Joy offers a monthly gatherings on Zoom, and we ask the question, Bible stories, what do they mean? Because
Yeah.
how important do you think this question could be?
I would rephrase the question slightly. So that whenever we're reading a biblical story, I think the first way of getting into the text and making it easy for people, because people try and find like the one right answer, and stories never have a one right answer. So instead of saying, what does this story mean? Say, what does this story mean to me?
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, or what does it mean to you? And at that point, you can't get it wrong. So the good news is you can't get it wrong because you're saying what it means to you. So you're being self-reflective. And the other part of the good news is you can't get it completely right either, because what it means to me may be very different than what it means to you or what it means to some third person. And those different meanings then become an opportunity for conversation. Why do you see this and not that? What happens if you add that into what you do see? Do you now see differently, or do you see more fully? Or has your lens changed so you have to readapt what you're seeing? And then for me, because I'm an historian, I want to know what that story meant to people in antiquity. So what do I get from reading the Hebrew if I'm looking at the scriptures of Israel? What do I get from reading the Greek? Where else do these words appear? New Testament is written in Greek. How did ancient rabbis interpret this particular text from Genesis? How did the church fathers interpret this particular text from Luke? How has the story been interpreted over time? What might it mean to people today in a sermon context? Because you just can't pull it out of the file. People have different needs depending upon what happened that previous week. What does the text mean anew in light of what we've just experienced? So those meanings will always continue to develop because human beings continue to develop. There's an old line from a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus who said, you can never step into the same river twice because the river always changes and you change. And I think it's the same thing with biblical stories. So if we read a story when we're 6 and then we read the same story when we're 60 and we get exactly the same meaning, something's gone wrong. And I don't think it's gone wrong with the Bible. I think it's gone wrong with our imagination. We get stuck. So reading the Bible over and over again, we should be able to see new things each time we read because we're bringing to it new experiences that we've had. And that should change what we see in the text.
I think that's a really crucial point for me, that during your lifetime, the stories changed for you, the way that you read them, the way you understand them. And if you do studies, then the meaning changes because you have some background information. And sometimes
Absolutely.
you're just in a situation where you don't feel the same way that you feel in a different situation. And so some people say, well, read the Bible, just take a random paragraph a day, and then you might come to the same paragraph a few months later or years later, but you'll see it's different to you. It appeals differently to you. And I think that you're right. If you have the same, you get the same meaning out of the same passage at the age of 6 or 60, that is a concern.
Right. Or I'm not happy about like opening the text at random. I'd much rather read something within its own
Yeah.
literary context. So if I just start with Matthew and I look at chapter 1, so I find out that just it's arbitrary thing. So Matthew refers to Joseph, Mary's husband, as a righteous man. Right? And what makes him righteous? he's willing to obey this angel and raise a child that is not his biological child and take this kid to Egypt. I mean, he has to relocate. He's a refugee. He's got to relocate. Joseph does a lot. I really like Joseph. So he's a righteous man. But then when I move on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. And now I've got this echo of righteousness. So what does it mean when I put what Joseph does, which is so over the top? Now I have to be even more righteous than the most righteous people who were there, who happen to be the scribes and the Pharisees. Or later when Mrs. Pilate sends word to Pilate when Jesus is being judged, and she says, have nothing to do with this righteous man. Now I got to go back. How does Jesus fit in there? So even that single echo of a word, the Greek term is dikaiosune, I'm now seeing new meaning in Matthew chapter 1 or in chapter 2 because I read on to chapter 5. Or I'm seeing new meaning because I read on to chapter 27. So when I start hearing those echoes, for me, it's like going to a symphony where you hear a theme in the first movement, and then you hear it again in the second movement, but it's played in a minor key on a different instrument. And then it comes back, boom, in the third movement. And now how do I hear that first movement differently? How do I hear that second movement differently? And the next time I go hear that symphony being performed, now I'm keyed in. I'm going to hear different things that I didn't hear the first time. So you read it and then you read it again and then you read it again. And each time you see something new or you hear something.
I think that's a really good recommendation for our listeners and our viewers. I think that this will be the first step to read the Bible differently, but also then to find out what does it mean to me. And thank you very much, Amy-Jill. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming to our Muffin Talk, and I hope to see you again for another recording sometime soon. It's
that would be great. I would look forward to that.
There's many topics we could talk about. Thank you so much.
All good.
Out there, heroic peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the world, a new day dawning and shining.